Hey, this is Wes from Resurrection Auto. Thanks for joining our channel today. We've got a 4.6 liter Ford F150 here that I recently purchased. Paid $1,500 for this truck. It had multiple engine codes when I purchased the vehicle and needed some major repair. So this vehicle is going to address those engine codes, engine problems, primarily dealing with the intake and some misfires. And so I appreciate you watching. Just want to let you know before we get started that I am a Christian. I'd love it if you took a chance at the end of your repair to take a look at my other video entitled How to Become a Christian. And with that said, let's get started on this vehicle. All right, so I've got the hood up here, and I want to let you know most of this video is going to deal with reassembly, as I had to do a lot of work in figuring out and diagnosing the problem, and I've already got the intake off. Nonetheless, let me show you the steps, as the intake was not really too difficult to take off. So let me just walk you through the steps quickly and let you take a peek. So I had to drain the radiator. The radiator valve, release valve, is down at the bottom down there on the left hand side, passenger side, and drained all the coolant off. Unhooked the main hose here, and then disconnected all of the peripherals here and labeled them. Most of them were just snap-off connectors or clamp-on hoses. There were a couple of vacuum lines that you twist and spin, but all in all, very simple to do. The fuel rail had 4 bolts securing it, and then the fuel line there at the back. The fuel line can be disconnected using these tools. I actually used the green one here. The tool pushes into the connection, and then the connection pops out. It was quite simple. The injectors and coils were both held in with just a single bolt, and you can see the location of those here on the gasket on the side. Very simple to do. And then finally, the intake also had one more item. I had to take off the alternator. So the belt tensioner is down here, 1/2 inch breaker bar into this belt tensioner here, and that removes the belt, and then just 4 bolts, all easily accessible, and the alternator comes off. So I've got the engine down to this point. I actually did do a compression test on the engine as well. Most of the cylinders were perfect. I had one cylinder that was lower than I prefer, but still should run okay. May burn a little bit of oil when we get it back together, but I think it'll be okay. And I was able to diagnose the problem. So let me get the intake so you can see it, and I'll show you exactly what went wrong with this truck. Okay, so on the right hand side, I'm just going to pick this gasket up. These gaskets are made by Felpro, and they are not the original gaskets. So this engine has been worked on before, and this problem has been addressed, or at least someone attempted to address it. And so I noticed that on this gasket, if you look on the very end where the water jacket is, it may be a little difficult to capture here on the camera. I'll do what I can here. Yep. Okay, so if you look right in here, the gasket has been flattened out pretty badly, and it was leaking and blowing coolant by right here. So this gasket is laid in like this, and when the mechanics put in the intake, they probably came in at an angle and came down, and they snagged the top of that gasket, pushing it in the wrong direction, and then tightened the bolts. So it had a pretty nasty leak at the back of the engine on the intake. But there were actually bigger problems. Come over here to the actual intake, and let me just show you a little bit of this intake quickly. You can see I've got everything labeled, and again, everything was pretty easy to take off. All the connections were either pop-on or a hose clamp, something like that. Here are the fuel rails, by the way, and they were just mounted, here and here. Very simple to take off. Nonetheless, there is an aluminum crossover piece here at the bottom. I've taken it off. It bolts on from the bottom of the intake. It sits on top, bolts on from the bottom. So you have to take the intake off to get to this. Here are the water jackets, and you can see that this intake blew apart. The plastic blew apart right there. This gasket is broken. Over on this side, we have similar problems around the gasket. So this intake was leaking badly. And the problem with this this vehicle, the reason it had misfires, is coolant was blowing past these points, leaking down into the wells of the spark plugs, shorting out the coils, and then causing the misfire. I noticed that when I took the top of the motor apart, that there were several different brands of coils. So what was happening is this vehicle was being taken to a mechanic. The mechanic diagnosed correctly the misfire, but the solution was to replace the coil. And you know, that works for when you drive it away from the mechanic, but as soon as the intake starts leaking again and you get enough water down in there again or coolant down in there again, it misfires again. And so someone probably spent a lot of money on this repair, but never got to the root cause. Okay, so let me just show you the parts I have to put this back together, and then we'll begin that process. Okay, so here's what I've purchased to make the repair, and I'll tell you what the costs are. I went ahead and purchased 8 coils for the engine. I don't know which of the old coils are still good. I do know that many of them were flooded with coolant, so I just don't know the condition. I preferred to go ahead and replace those. I bought these from Advanced Auto for just under $200 for that box. Of course, new spark plugs, and so those are relatively inexpensive. I think those were about $30. And then I purchased a new intake. Now, you can either get this from Advanced Auto, a Dorman part, which is what I did, for around about $350. You can also buy the OEM from Ford, which is closer to $500. I think that the Ford model is a better intake based on what I can tell and the research I've done. However, this truck is 12 years old already, and I wasn't prepared to spend that much money on it, and so I think the Dorman's going to work just fine. So I've got that ready, and so those are the main components that I'm going to need to replace or get this vehicle back on the road. So I've spent about $600, and I think for that amount this truck may run again. So let me show you the next step and we'll see what happens. Next thing I want to do is, let's go ahead and get these gaskets out of the way, is I am going to take a shop vac and get all of the dirt and grime off of this and go ahead and clean this up as best I can just with a vacuum cleaner. So let me take care of that, and then we'll move forward with actually cleaning the surfaces of those aluminum heads. Now that I've got everything vacuumed out, I'm just going to take a shop towels. These are kind of like a paper towel, of course, and I'm just going to fill the intake on each of the cylinders to prevent any dirt from getting down in there. So I'll take a moment and do all 8 cylinders now. What I'll do is take just a common razor blade, and I'm just going to try to remove as much of the dirt as possible in order to really get this surface cleaned and in good preparation for the gasket to go on. Now, I've already removed these spark plugs, so it's probably best if I go ahead and insert the new ones so that when I clean this up I don't get any debris down into the cylinder via the spark plug holes. So let me get the spark plugs in. I'll show you the gap on those that's correct, and getting those installed, and then I guess we'll do this after we put the spark plugs in. Okay, so I've got my spark plugs ready to go in, and based on my research, 0.054 is the right gap for this spark plug in this truck. So I've got this gapped, and again, based on my research, I'm going to install these and torque them to 25 foot-pounds. I'm choosing not to use any kind of anti-seize on the threads. Some people do put some on there, but I'm going to choose not to. And so let me get those installed and we'll move forward with getting these heads cleaned. Got everything scraped down here. I'm just going to vacuum one more time, then apply a little bit of carburetor cleaner to a rag and just get the surface completely clean. It really wasn't much gasket material or dirt on it anyway because of the style gasket that is used in this application. But I got to just take time to make sure it's really, really clean, then we'll move on to the next step. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is actually install the new intake onto the top of the motor. The reason I'm going to do that next is because the old intake required a gasket kit underneath the intake. And so there's no gasket material here. There's actually a separate, I think I showed it to you in an earlier video, there's actually a separate gasket that goes underneath here. Whereas the new intake, the gaskets are embedded as a part of the unit. So I have to switch out a lot of components on the top of the intake, including the throttle body and all these accessories. But I need to have this secure and safe. I don't want to do this on the bench top here and risk damaging some of these components. So we're going to go ahead and install this next, and then we'll begin moving and transferring the components over as needed. Okay, so I've just got the intake sitting on top of the motor now. A couple of quick notes. Of course, remember to remove the paper towels you used to block the intake ports. You certainly wouldn't want those down in the motor with this on top. And secondly, it's important to set this unit down on top of the motor, not slide it into place. There's a tendency, especially because of some of the cabling here in the back, to want to kind of set it down and then slide it into place. But that's exactly what caused the last failure, at least in part, because if you do that, you're going to roll the gaskets and then they'll become ineffective in holding either the air or the coolant that they're supposed to seal. So that's in place. Next thing I'm going to do is just by hand go ahead and thread in the 8 bolts that hold this to the top of the motor. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is install the thermostat. There's a gasket that goes underneath. Thermostat goes on top. Now this Dorman kit is made for several models, and on my model the instructions tell me to measure the flange there of this elbow unit, and if it's over a certain distance to use this little aluminum spacer. So I've got that installed, and then that will go here on top, like so. Okay, the torque specifications and bolt pattern for securing the intake are as follows. Let's see. So we're going to begin with this one over here. All these are 18 inch-pounds to begin with. 1, then 2, 3 over here, 4, then up to the front, 5, and let's see, 6, then all the way to the back, all the way to the back one, 7, 8, then the front one here, 9, 10, 11. So we're going to do 18 inch-pounds, which is basically just snug them up, and then 18 foot-pounds to secure them. Okay, a couple of parts to assemble on the aluminum crossover here. So this has to be installed, and you'll notice this already has some thread sealant on it. I'll need to tighten this until the back points, or excuse me, that tube points to the back. That's the way the other one is located, so I'll have to put that one on. And then on this side, there's another port here, but I don't need that. The other intake does not have it, so I'm assuming that's for other model vehicles that may use that port. They did supply these cap screws, so I'm going to simply use some Teflon tape for sealant on that. Then it's an Allen wrench here, hex head, and screw this in until it's appropriately tight. I don't have a torque specification on it, so let me get those installed and we'll keep moving on this intake. Okay, the next piece I'm going to take off and place on the new intake is this unit here. Looks like it's got a couple of Torxes to hold it here. The hose comes around and attaches via a clamp to that piece we just installed. Alright, as you can see, I've got the hose clamp attached. Unit installed. Now toward the back, you'll notice that hose 10 goes into inlet 10, so we'll take care of that next. Okay, going to go ahead and lay the fuel rails in place. It's not yet time to connect them, but some of the other components go over top, and it's just easier to go ahead and get those kind of installed at this point. So those are installed. Move on to the next step. Next thing we'll do is put in some vacuum lines. Toward the back is number 11. It weaves down under and over here to the fuel rail, number 3, and then comes around the other side and will eventually connect to the right side of the throttle body there. Okay, we're going to take off the brake booster hose. This is at the very back of the intake, and the lower port there goes around and connects obviously to the brake booster. 2 clamps, pull that off and install it on the other intake. Alright, looks like we got a similar situation on the right hand side of the intake. This unit needs to come off, and it's held in by, it looks like number 10 or maybe number 8 bolts on this side, and then also up here on the top. So I'll remove those and move that over. Okay, and this vacuum line here, there we go. This vacuum line here connects to the very top port at the very back here. It is located here. It's going to make that connection, and then the last item we'll have to do is to connect the throttle body here, which is still on the old intake here. So just 4 bolts that hold that on. I think there's a gasket perhaps behind it, maybe not, but I'll move that over and we should be getting pretty close to having this truck back on the road. Okay, and as you take the throttle body off, you want to make sure to also carry with it this special gasket. It's got some clips on the edges here that go into holes on the top and the sides there. So going to move this over and get that throttle body installed. So since we've got this taken apart, it's a great time to use a little bit of carburetor cleaner and clean out the throat of the throttle body. It's pretty, if you can see it, it's pretty gummed up in there. So I'm just going to take a minute and clean this up before we install it. Okay, next thing we're going to do is install our coil packs. Pretty straightforward. So the coil goes down into the spark plug hole and is secured by a single bolt into the plastic intake, and then the connector plugs into the housing right there. Okay, so we'll get all of those 8 installed and we'll move forward from there. Okay, so we've got all the coils in on the top of the manifold and secured. So the next thing we want to put in are the fuel injectors. Now these are the original fuel injectors, and as you can see, they are really dirty. So I'm going to take some time and try to get these nice and cleaned up. I'm also going to inspect each one of those seals to make sure they're not cracked or broken. And then once we do that, we'll show you how to install them. Okay, there's the first injector in place. Super simple. Once I cleaned it up with a little carburetor cleaner, they just press into the top of the manifold. It just slides in, honestly, in good shape. Plug in your connector and we can move on to the next one. Okay, on some of these connectors, the latch that is inside of here is broken. And so it plugs fine, but unfortunately there's no guarantee that it'll stay latched. So I've used a cable tie to secure it through the connector and around the fuel injector. I really hate this kind of repair. Those connectors from Ford were $45 a piece. And so, you know, it's going to be hundreds of dollars to replace those connectors. You can buy them on Amazon. I think 8 connectors for around 20 bucks. So I don't have time to wait for that. I got to get this truck on the road. So I think this will be a repair I do at a later date. So that's what I use. Not excited about it, but I did want to let you know how to do a workaround in case you needed to. Okay, the next thing I've done is simply taken the fuel rail and with the palm of my hand pushed down to seat all of the fuel injectors under the bottom of that fuel rail, and then I'll secure them with the 2 bolts that came with the kit here and at the back, right back here, and secure this side. Okay, on the right side, same procedure. Going to press the fuel rail into the injectors. The very back there is the fuel line, the input line to the fuel rails. I didn't show disassembly, so let me take a moment and show you. You'll need this tool. I use the green one. It inserts into the fuel line from the front, and you press into that ring and it will disconnect this fuel line. So when you're reinstalling it, there should be a firm click so that there's a good seal there. You certainly wouldn't want fuel leaking there. So I'm going to put in the bolts now, one in the front, one in the back, and we'll move to the next procedure. Okay, it's time to start reconnecting a few things. And so the electrical line for the fuel system is here, plugs in. Again, I've got these labeled, so it's really easy for me to identify. We've got the throttle control here. We have this water hose here. And then number 1 back here is a vacuum line that's tucked under the alternator for the moment, but I'm going to pull that out and reconnect these items. Okay, so I've set the alternator in here. It bolts on 2 in the top, and the ones in the bottom, you can see right there, the alternator is slotted, so you can go ahead and start those and set the alternator on top of them, secure all 4 bolts, and the alternator will be installed. Okay, and as we're wrapping things up here, I realized I made a mistake on the thermostat housing. I believe in a previous video I had demonstrated that the seal went under the thermostat. That's incorrect. It should go on the top here. That's what seals the elbow joint out. And so I simply just pulled this back off real quick and corrected the gasket position, and we'll move forward with the repair. Okay, got a couple of items to connect on the right side. The exhaust recirculation input has got to be put on. This is really simple. Just screws into the housing there. We've got an electrical connector here that goes into this I've labeled number 5. Number 4 here goes into the intake like this, the big intake hose. So let me get those installed and we'll keep moving. Okay, it's time to put the main drive belt back on. I've already got it installed here. The picture is in on the front of the engine here. This is the 4.6 liter, that's the pattern. Breaker bar goes down into the tensioner, 1/2 inch breaker bar. You pull it to the left this way and it will create a lack of tension. You can slip on the belt on all of those pulleys. I did it by myself and it wasn't too bad. So we're just about there, just got to install a few more things and then we'll be ready to crank this and see if the misfires are all gone. Okay, next thing we're going to do is install this bracket onto the steering pump reservoir. It's attached by 1 bolt on the top of the intake and 2 on the reservoir itself. Pretty straightforward. Okay, it's time to reattach the upper radiator hose to the thermostat housing and fill the reservoir full of coolant. The last thing will be to do is just to simply install the intake here and attach number 4 to number 4, obviously. And this vehicle should be all ready for to be on the road again. So let me get these things squared away and then I'll shoot some final footage of hopefully this vehicle running without any misfires. Alright, we began with this truck. It had 8 different engine codes, all of them or most of them associated with misfires. It had a misfire on 3, misfire on 7. It had a code for multiple misfires, another code for misfires within the first 1,000 RPMs. It had a mass airflow sensor problem, and so as you've seen, we've replaced the intake. So let's give her a crank and see what is going on now. You'll notice there are no check engine lights on, so we've cured the problem there. The truck sounds really good, runs really smooth. So I think we've got this one taken care of. Hey, I want to remind you that I'm a Christian, and the reason I shot this video was first to get your vehicle back on the road. I hope I provided some nice information for you and that you're able to use it to get your vehicle on the road. And second, so that you could just think about Christianity. I've got a video posted, it's only 2 minutes, that shares how to become a Christian. If you have a moment, once you get your stuff on the road, I just invite you to watch that. Hey, thanks for taking some time to spend with me. Take care, and God bless.